Across the world, people remembered a cataclysm. They told of floods that swallowed valleys. They told of mountains that seemed to sink before the rising tide. They told of cities that vanished beneath the waves. These memories lived in chants. They were carved into tablets. They were whispered around fires under star-filled skies. Though the languages were different and the cultures never met, their stories shared the same haunting image. A great flood that changed everything. What if this was not only a myth? What if the Great Flood was real? And if it was, did it reset humanity? For centuries, the flood was treated as a parable. Scholars saw it as allegory, a tale of divine punishment and moral renewal. The faithful believed it was justice, the cleansing of the earth so that life could begin anew. But the ground beneath our feet and the seas around us still hold traces of something more. Archaeologists have uncovered sudden layers of silt. These layers interrupt the remains of ancient towns, as though entire communities were buried by water in a single violent moment. Geologists have mapped ancient shorelines that now lie far above today's seas. They are silent markers of oceans that once rose with frightening speed. In sheltered bays and along forgotten coasts, divers have found temples and streets, places where there should be nothing but sand and stone. These are not inventions of imagination. They are scars carved into the earth itself. At the end of the last ice age, the world shifted. Glaciers melted, torrents of water poured into the oceans. Sea levels climbed higher with each passing year. Fertile plains were drowned. Valleys were erased. Whole landscapes were lost forever. For those who lived through it, the world must have felt as though it was ending. Imagine the horizon creeping closer each season. Imagine the fields that once fed your family, and the homes of your ancestors slowly gone. Survivors would not forget. They carried the memory. They told it to their children. They passed it down through the generations, until memory became story, and story hardened into legend. But legend does not exist in isolation. When hundreds of cultures, separated by oceans and centuries, preserve the same story, we are left to wonder, is myth only a story? Or is it history remembered in another form? Could the Great Flood have been not just a moral tale? Could it have been a record of survival itself? Tonight, we follow the echoes of the Great Flood. We uncover ruins beneath the sea. We search for forgotten civilizations. We explore the forces that may have caused the catastrophe itself. If this journey sparks your curiosity, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so we can keep exploring the hidden past of our world together. The story of the flood does not belong to one people alone. It rises again and again across the oldest records of humanity. Each tradition carries its own voice, yet all describe the same kind of devastation. These accounts form the foundation of our search. They are not fragments scattered at random, but patterns that stretch across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia, the earliest written tale of the flood was set down more than 4,000 years ago. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, a man chosen by the gods to survive when the great waters came. He was warned in a dream. He was told to build a vessel and to bring inside not only his family, but the seed of every living thing. When the storm passed and the waters fell, his boat came to rest on a mountain. There he released a dove and a raven to see if the land had returned. This account, pressed into clay, echoes with details later retold in other traditions. It shows that the idea of a catastrophic deluge had already taken deep root in Sumerian memory. Centuries later, in the Hebrew Bible, a similar story was told of Noah. He too was warned. He too built an ark. He too preserved life through a storm that covered the earth. When the rain ceased, his ark also rested upon a mountain. He too released a dove to search for land. Scholars have long noted the parallels between these traditions. Many argue that the Hebrew story drew upon older Mesopotamian sources, but to the listener, the similarities point to something even deeper. A memory so powerful that it passed from culture to culture, reshaped but never erased. Far to the east in India, the flood was remembered through the tale of Manu. According to the Vedic hymns, Manu was warned by a small fish. The fish grew into a great being and urged him to build a boat. As the waters rose, Manu was guided to safety. preserving mankind for a new age. This was not a story of divine wrath, but of cosmic cycles and rebirth. Yet the core remains. A flood so immense it nearly ended the human world. In Greece, the myth was told of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Angered by human corruption, Zeus sent waters to drown the land. Only Deucalion and his wife survived. They drifted in a chest until they came to rest on Mount Parnassus. From there they cast stones over their shoulders. The stones transformed into men and women repopulating the world. The details differ, the gods have new names, but again the pattern is the same. Water erases civilization. A chosen pair survives. Humanity begins anew. Even in China, the memory endured. The story of Yu the Great tells of a time when floodwaters threatened to swallow the empire. For years Yu laboured, dredging rivers and carving channels to tame the waters. Unlike the sudden storms of other myths, here the flood lasted for generations. It reshaped the land and forced order to rise from chaos. The Chinese remembered not only destruction, but also the creation of a new order in the aftermath. When we step back from the details, the common themes shine through. From the Fertile Crescent to the Yellow River, from the Aegean to the Ganges, the world's oldest stories describe a flood that ended what came before and demanded a new beginning. The question remains, why? Why do so many cultures, distant in space and time, remember the same terror? Archaeology offers part of the answer. In Mesopotamia, excavations at ancient cities such as Shuruppak and Kish revealed a sudden layer of clay and silt. It was dated to around 2900 before the Common Era. This layer cut across the ruins of homes and streets, as if a massive flood had swept through, burying life in an instant. To those who survived, the event would have been unforgettable. To their descendants, it became the story of a great deluge sent by the gods. Half a world away, in China, geologists studying the Yellow River uncovered evidence of a catastrophic flood in the Jishi Gorge. In 2016, a study published in Science described how a landslide dam collapsed around 1900 before the Common Era. It released a torrent so massive that it swept villages and fields for hundreds of miles downstream. Ancient texts recorded in the time of Yu the Great describe floods lasting for generations. Here at last, the science and the legend meet. Beyond individual floods, the Earth's climate history reveals something even larger. At the end of the last ice age, between 15 and 8,000 years ago, glaciers covering much of the northern hemisphere melted away. Vast lakes burst their icy walls. Meltwater pulses raised sea levels by more than 100 meters. Coastlines vanished, land bridges sank. Whole regions that once supported life are now under the ocean. This was not a single storm or a local disaster, but a planetary transformation. For those who lived through it, the rising seas must have seemed like the end of the world. The pattern is clear. Across cultures, across centuries, and across continents, the memory of the flood appears again and again. Archaeology uncovers layers of destruction. Geology records the scars of sudden waters. Climate science shows us seas that rose high enough to erase entire landscapes. Myths and science, legend and evidence, speak in unison. If these stories are fragments of memory, then perhaps the flood was not only a story told to explain the past. Perhaps it was an echo of events that truly reshaped the Earth. And if this memory is real, we must ask the question that lingers at the edge of every discovery. If this memory was real, where are the ruins of those who lived before the flood? History books often begin with Sumer. It rose in Mesopotamia around 4,000 years before the Common Era. It is remembered as the first civilization with cities, writing, and law. Yet across the world lie traces that suggest there were older worlds, worlds drowned by rising seas and remembered in flood legends. These are not simply stories. They are ruins and landscapes studied by scientists. They are mapped and dated. They whisper that the Great Flood may have been history written into stone and silt. Beneath the cold waters of the North Sea lies Doggerland. It was once a vast plain stretching from Britain to continental Europe. Around 12,000 years before the Common Era, at the end of the last ice age, it was home to hunters and gatherers. They followed rivers across meadows and forests. The proof comes not only from legend, but from direct finds. Since the 1930 seconds, fishermen have hauled up antlers, bones, and finely worked flint tools from the Dogger Bank and Brown Bank. These were objects that belonged to people who once walked where the sea now lies. Sediment cores drilled into the seabed bring up layers of peat, pollen, and ancient soils. Clear evidence of forests and marshland drowned long ago. In 1998, British archaeologist Brian E. Coles published detailed reconstructions showing Doggerland's rivers, valleys, and lakes before they disappeared. Then, in 1997, Norwegian geologist Svein Bondevik and his colleagues studied the Storegga submarine landslide. They found sheets of marine sand buried within inland peat bogs in Scotland. This was proof that a tsunami more than 20 metres high swept across coasts around 6,200 years before the Common Era. Rising seas were already eating away at Doggerland. But the tsunami may have finished what time began. Here is a clear case where people lived, built, hunted, and fished. They watched their entire land vanish beneath the flood. Farther east, in India, myth and archaeology meet in Dwarka. Ancient Sanskrit texts remember it as the glittering city of Lord Krishna, swallowed by the ocean. For centuries it was treated as allegory. Then, beginning in 1983, Indian archaeologist S.R. Rao, a former director of the Archaeological Survey of India, led underwater surveys off the coast of Gujarat. By the late 1980 seconds, his team had documented stone walls, steps, and artifacts lying beneath the tide near modern Dwarka. Pottery and beads dated to the second millennium before the Common Era. Still ancient, but not beyond the known timeline. In 2001, the story deepened. S. Badrinarian and Gore conducted sonar surveys in the Gulf of Cambay. They detected vast geometric patterns across more than 30 square kilometres of seabed, long straight lines, right angles, and what appeared to be foundations. Dredging brought up artefacts, including a workpiece of wood. Radiocarbon tests in 2002 dated the wood to about 7,500 years before the Common Era. Critics argued that a single sample could not prove the site's age, but the discovery remains extraordinary. If accurate, the Cambay structures predate Sumer by 3 millennia. They suggest a city erased by the flood and remembered only in legend. To the east, near the Japanese island of Yonaguni, lies another haunting mystery. In 1986, diver Kihachiro Arataki came across strange stone formations on the seabed. Terraces seemed to step down in precise layers. Wide platforms stretched like plazas. A staircase rose into the deep. Soon geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus began systematic study. Through the 1990 seconds and into the early 2000 seconds, Kimura argued that the structures were man-made, perhaps dating back to 10,000 years before the Common Era. At that time, sea levels were still climbing after the Ice Age. He pointed to features resembling post holes, cut channels, and deliberate shaping. Others disagreed. In 1999, geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University examined the site. He suggested that natural processes such as jointing in sandstone could create similar shapes. The debate remains unresolved. Yet the scale is undeniable. At more than 70 metres long and 20 metres tall, the Yonaguni monument rises like a drowned pyramid. If natural, it is remarkable. If even partly human, it belongs to a civilization that stood at the dawn of the Holocene, a civilization erased as the seas rose. Across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, sonar brought back an even deeper riddle. In 2001, marine engineer Paulina Zalitsky and her team were surveying off the Guanahacabibes Peninsula of western Cuba. They recorded geometric patterns 600 meters below the surface. The images revealed rectangles and grids. They resembled plazas, avenues, and even pyramid-like forms. At such depth, if these are man-made, they would date back to more than 10,000 years before the Common Era. At that time, sea levels were far lower. No full excavation has been mounted since. The currents are strong, the waters are dark, the depth is daunting. Skeptics point to sonar illusions or geological formations. But if the forms are cultural, They represent a civilization that predates every record we have. A civilization drowned so completely that history has forgotten it. Not all evidence rests beneath the sea. On a hill in southeastern Turkey lies Göbekli Tepe, a place that changed the way we understand the deep past. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavations. What he uncovered was astonishing. Massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles. Some were more than 5 meters tall. They were carved with foxes, boars, snakes and vultures. Radiocarbon dating places its construction around 9,600 years before the Common Era. This was at the very end of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change. According to conventional history, people at that time were simple hunter-gatherers. Yet here was proof of organized labor, ritual and artistry on a monumental scale. Göbekli Tepe was not drowned, but it belongs to the same story. It shows that survivors of upheaval gathered to build again after catastrophe. They left a monument that still stands at the threshold of history. Each of these sites carries its own mystery, but all point to the same truth. The sea has taken more than land. It has taken lives, cities, and perhaps entire civilizations. Doggerland drowned between 12,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era. Cambay may record a city from 7,500 years before the Common Era. Yonaguni could date to 10,000 years before the Common Era. The Cuban site lies so deep it would belong to the very start of the Holocene. Göbekli Tepe proves that humanity began anew around 9,600 years before the Common Era. If you find these traces convincing, take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. Stay with us. Next, we will explore the evidence many believe reveals the very cause of the Great Flood, the hidden forces behind the catastrophe that may have reset humanity itself. One of the most convincing causes of the Great Flood is found at the end of the last ice age. For tens of thousands of years, massive glaciers locked away much of the planet's water. Seas stood more than 100 meters lower than today. Lands that now lie drowned under the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, or the Sunda Shelf were once open plains where people hunted, fished, and settled. Then the climate began to shift. Temperatures rose. Ice that had endured for millennia melted. Torrents of water poured into the oceans. The story of this transformation has been measured in coral reefs. In 1989, Richard Fairbanks studied ancient corals in Barbados. He discovered evidence of a sudden surge called Meltwater Pulse 1A. Around 14,600 years ago, sea levels rose nearly 20 meters in less than 5 centuries. For people living along the coasts, that meant the horizon crept inland not over millennia, but within lifetimes. In 2012, Pierre Deschamps confirmed the same dramatic rise from corals drilled in Tahiti. He showed the surge was global, and in 2014, Kurt Lambeck reconstructed the full picture. From the glacial maximum to the early Holocene, seas climbed more than 120 meters. The numbers may sound abstract, but their meaning was devastating. Entire valleys drowned, coastal plains disappeared, land bridges that once connected continents sank beneath the waves. For those who saw their homes consumed, it must have felt as if the earth itself had turned against them. This massive rise alone could explain why so many cultures remember a flood that changed the world. But the end of the Ice Age brought more than steady melting. It may also have brought a sudden catastrophe from the sky. Around 12,800 years ago, the planet was thrown into turmoil by an abrupt return to cold. This interval is known as the Younger Dryas. For over 1,000 years, glaciers advanced once more, only to retreat in a violent swing back to warmth. What caused this sudden shift has long been debated. In 2007, Richard Firestone and his colleagues proposed that fragments of a comet struck the ice sheets of North America at the onset of the Younger Dryas. Their evidence came from melted glass, carbon spherules, and nanodiamonds found in soil layers dated precisely to this boundary. These materials form only under extreme heat, the kind unleashed by cosmic impact. In 2015, James Kennett added to the case. He found the same markers not only in North America, but also in Europe and the Middle East. If such an impact occurred, it could have unleashed chaos on a planetary scale. Ice sheets would have fractured, sudden torrents of meltwater would have poured into the seas. Vast lakes trapped behind glacial walls may have burst in outpourings that swept across the land. Forests would have burned. Skies would have darkened. Animals that had roamed the continents for millennia vanished forever. And for the people who endured it, the flood would not have been a slow encroachment. It would have come with terrifying speed, as if the heavens themselves had opened. The memory of such a cataclysm would be preserved not only in geology, but also in legend. It would be remembered as divine punishment, or the judgment of gods. While the melting of ice and a possible comet strike provide the global foundation for the flood tradition, regional disasters added vivid strokes to the story. Around 6,200 years before the Common Era, a massive submarine landslide known as the Storegga Slide tore away a section of the Norwegian continental shelf. The collapse sent a tsunami racing across the North Atlantic. In 1997, geologist Svein Bondevik examined peat bogs in Scotland. He discovered layers of marine sand buried far inland. This was clear evidence that waves more than 20 meters high had swept across the coast. To the people of Northern Europe, the flood was not a metaphor. It was a wave that came in a single night, erasing fields and villages. Such an event would echo for generations, reinforcing the memory of a world at the mercy of water. Farther south, another cataclysm unfolded around the Black Sea. In 1997, William Ryan and Walter Pittman studied sediment cores. They revealed a sudden transition from freshwater organisms to marine life. The scholars concluded that around 5,600 years before the Common Era, waters from the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus and poured into the lower basin. The result was a rise of more than 100 meters in only a few years. Farms and towns along the shorelines would have been drowned almost at once. Families fled inland, carrying with them the story of a deluge that destroyed their world. To many scholars, this event stands as the geological counterpart to the biblical flood of Noah. It is where memory and scripture converge. The combination of global and regional forces created an age of upheaval unlike any other. The slow but relentless rise of the seas transformed the face of the planet. A possible cosmic strike may have turned that slow drowning into violent surges. Local catastrophes, from tsunamis to inland seas breaking loose, etched sharp scars into human experience. The Great Flood remembered in legend was not a single storm. It was a series of overlapping disasters that together reset the course of humanity. The consequences were immense. Fertile plains vanished beneath the oceans, harbours and trade routes were lost forever. Populations were displaced. They were forced inland to rebuild in new landscapes. Archaeological evidence shows abrupt shifts in settlement patterns. It is as if whole communities had been uprooted. Genetic studies suggest that the human population shrank during these centuries before expanding again. This bottleneck mirrors the stories of survival carried forward in myth. To later generations, the destruction was explained as punishment, cleansing, or renewal. To us, it appears as the work of nature itself. Vast and indifferent, yet powerful enough to leave its memory carved in both stone and story. When we listen to the flood myths of Sumer, of Israel, of India, Greece and China, we hear echoes of real events. Melting glaciers, collapsing ice, surging seas, waves that swept away everything familiar. And if such a reset has already taken place once, perhaps more than once, then the question lingers. Are we truly the first civilization, or only the latest in a cycle that has played out before? If you are still with us, take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe was the true cause of the Great Flood, or is there another theory you find more convincing? When the waters fell back, the world was not the same. New coastlines appeared. Valleys were gone. Yet what truly remained was memory. People carried that memory forward. They shaped it into stories, rituals, and beliefs. The Great Flood was not only an event, it became a foundation. It became a way to explain what it meant to be human. Religion shows this most clearly. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list divides time into two parts, before the flood and after. The deluge was treated as the line between ages. Afterward, kingship was said to have descended from heaven again. It was as if authority had to restart with the world itself. In the Hebrew Bible, the covenant of Noah marked a new order of life on earth. In India, The tale of Manu showed that Dharma, the cosmic law, returned after chaos. Each culture used the flood to explain not just destruction but the renewal of order. This pattern spread into ritual. Across civilizations, water became the symbol of cleansing. In Mesopotamian temples, priests washed before entering sacred space. In India, immersion in the Ganges became a way to purify body and soul. In Greece, and later in Rome, washing was part of rites of passage. In Christianity, baptism symbolized death of the old self and rebirth into the new. Across oceans, in the Aztec world, myths told of an earlier age destroyed by water. Ceremonies of renewal often involved offerings to lakes and springs. The message was the same everywhere. Water destroys, but water also makes life begin again. Archaeology confirms this legacy in physical ruins. In the 1992, Frank Goddio uncovered the sunken Egyptian cities of Thonis, Herakleion and Canopus. They had been lying beneath the sea for more than 1,000 years. In Denmark, divers found Mesolithic fishing traps preserved underwater. These were reminders of Doggerland's last inhabitants, as the seas rose around 6,000 years before the Common Era. In the Baltic, sonar mapping in 2014 revealed stone tools and ancient hearths now buried offshore. Each discovery shows how human life, once rooted on dry land, could be erased in an instant. The ocean has been swallowing history far longer than we imagine. Science also shows how deeply this memory endured. In 2021, a genetic study published in Nature found evidence of population bottlenecks at the end of the Ice Age. Human numbers shrank, then grew again. The pattern mirrors the myths, a world nearly destroyed, then reborn. Cognitive scientists such as Merlin Donald have argued that oral cultures keep memory alive by embedding trauma in story. The flood may be the greatest example. Its details change across cultures, but the outline remains the same. Water rises, life is lost, survivors rebuild. Even today, the echo has power. Flood stories appear not only in sacred texts, but also in art and film. From Mesopotamian tablets to modern cinema, the motif repeats. The world swept clean. Humanity forced to begin again. With seas now rising under climate change, people often describe it as a new flood. Ancient fear has become modern metaphor. The legacy of the Great Flood is double-edged. It reminds us of nature's power to erase, but it also carries the belief that from ruin life can return. In stories, in rituals, in ruins beneath the sea, the memory of water remains. If such memory can survive for 10,000 years, perhaps it is because the ocean still holds more than we know. The drowned cities we have found may only be the beginning. Out beyond the shallow coasts, deeper still, whole civilizations may wait in silence. Untouched, unexcavated. The story of the flood leads us to one last reflection. If waters once rose high enough to erase whole worlds, what else might remain hidden beneath the seas? From time to time, fragments rise to the surface. Clues that whisper of a past stranger than we imagine. One of the most intriguing clues is a map. In 1513, the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis drew a world chart on gazelle skin. Much of it reflects the knowledge of his day. The Atlantic, the coasts of Africa, the outlines of South America. But in the southern margin appears something baffling. The coast of Antarctica. Not the Antarctica we know, buried under ice. A coastline drawn as if it were free of glaciers. Geographers debate the meaning. Some say Piri Reis copied older charts now lost. Perhaps they were preserved from a forgotten source. Others dismiss it as coincidence or error. Yet the image lingers. How could a 16th century mapmaker know the shape of land hidden under kilometers of ice? If the outline was truly accurate, it suggests that someone, long before our history books begin, had seen the world when Antarctica was still bare rock and shore. Modern science too brings new mysteries to light. Along the coasts of the Mediterranean, sonar surveys have traced ancient shorelines far below the surface. These are the so-called paleo coastlines. In the waters off Greece, Italy, and Cyprus, geologists have mapped terraces and submerged beaches. They reveal where the sea once stood thousands of years ago. In the Indian Ocean, Similar scans have revealed drowned valleys stretching away from today's coasts. Valleys that may have held villages and harbours before the floods of the Ice Age swept them away. These ghostly outlines, invisible from the shore, show us that much of human history still lies beneath the waves, untouched, unmapped, waiting. What we know is already astonishing, yet what we do not know may be greater still. If Doggerland, Dwarka, Yonaguni, and other sites are only the first glimpses, then perhaps vast chapters of our story remain unwritten. Imagine libraries of stone lying deep in the Mediterranean, temples scattered across the drowned plains of the Indian Ocean, whole settlements sealed under layers of silt. Each discovery could rewrite what we believe about the rise of civilization. And so the flood is not only a memory of the past, it is also a question for the present. If the sea still holds forgotten cities, then the history we call the beginning, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, may not be the beginning at all. They may be only the second or third attempt of humanity to rise from the waters. So let the thought linger as the story closes. If the Great Flood once reset the world, how many times has the cycle repeated, and how many more secrets lie waiting, hidden in the deep, for us to uncover? If this journey has stirred your imagination, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more explorations into erased history. Good night.